I stared at the empty chair across from me, the candle between us guttering in its glass holder, and felt the familiar burn of humiliation crawl up my throat. 45 minutes late again. My phone buzzed. Not him. Never him. Just the waiter, probably wondering how much longer I'd sit here like an idiot, nursing my water while other diners shot me pitying glances. I knew what they were thinking. Poor girl got stood up. They didn't know this was the fourth time in 2 months. They didn't know I'd spent my entire paycheck on this dress, on getting my hair done, on the Uber here, because Derek said we needed to celebrate something special tonight. They didn't know that in exactly 7 minutes, my stepmother Lydia would post a photo on social media of Derek laughing at some bar across town, his arm around my stepsister Veronica's waist. Because I'd lived this before. I died at 28, and I'd been reborn at 18, right back to the beginning of my personal hell. And this moment, this specific soul-crushing moment, was where it all started last time, where I became the family joke, where Derek chose Veronica, where my life spiraled into a decade of abuse so systematic, so cruel, that it eventually killed me. But not this time. My phone buzzed again, right on schedule. "Sweetie, just saw Derek at Murphy's. He's with Veronica. They look so cute together. Don't be upset, honey. Some things just aren't meant to be." The message was from Lydia, of course, dripping with false sympathy while she twisted the knife. In my first life, I'd seen that message while walking home in the rain, my expensive heels giving me blisters, mascara running down my face. I'd cried for 3 days. I'd begged Derek for an explanation. I'd believed him when he said it was just a misunderstanding. I'd been such a fool. Now I calmly flagged down the waiter, ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the menu, the lobster, the filet mignon, the chocolate soufflé. I ordered everything Derek had promised to pay for, everything I'd been too nervous to order before because I didn't want to seem high maintenance. When the waiter's eyebrows rose slightly, I smiled. My date is running late, but he insisted I start without him. He said to put it all on his card. He already gave you one to keep on file, right? The waiter nodded slowly, checking his notes. "Yes, ma'am, Mr. Harrison's card." "Perfect. Oh, and another bottle of the Chateau Margaux to go, please, for the inconvenience." 30 minutes later, I walked out of that restaurant full, slightly buzzed, and 12,200 lighter in Derek's wallet. I'd left cash for the waiter's tip, a generous one, because he'd played along beautifully, probably sensing the delicious revenge in action. But this was just the appetizer. The real story started 10 years ago on the day my father married Lydia Chambers and brought her and her daughter Veronica into our home. I was 8 years old, still grieving my mother who'd died of cancer just 18 months earlier. Dad promised me nothing would change. He promised Lydia wanted to be a family. He lied. Or maybe he was just weak. So desperate for companionship, for someone to fill the void Mom left, that he couldn't see what Lydia really was. A predator who'd targeted a wealthy widower. A woman who'd brought her spoiled, vicious daughter into our home with one mission: take everything. It started small. Lydia would accidentally shrink my clothes in the wash while Veronica's were perfectly fine. She'd make my favorite meals but serve me the burnt portions. She'd sign Veronica up for dance classes and art lessons, but somehow forget to register me, telling Dad it was my choice not to participate. "Claire just isn't interested in these things," she'd say sweetly. "She's more of a bookish child." She made bookish sound like a disease. Dad, who traveled constantly for work, never noticed, or didn't want to. By the time I was 12, Lydia had convinced him I was the problem. Moody, difficult, ungrateful for everything they'd done for me. Veronica, meanwhile, was perfect. Pretty, charming, always ready with a smile and a hug for Daddy. The physical abuse started when I was 14. I'd gotten accepted into a prestigious summer art program, a full scholarship. I was so proud. Art was the one thing that was mine, the one place where I could escape. I'd inherited my mother's talent, spent hours in my room sketching and painting while Veronica was out being popular and perfect. Lydia found my acceptance letter before I could show Dad. I came home from school to find my entire portfolio destroyed, every sketch, Every painting, years of work, shredded and scattered across my bedroom floor. My paints were poured down the sink. My brushes snapped in half. Veronica stood in the doorway, smirking. Oops, Mom was cleaning and I guess some things got damaged. I'd tried to fight back that day. Physically lunged at Veronica, years of rage finally exploding. Lydia had been waiting for it. She grabbed my wrist so hard it left bruises, shoved me against the wall, and hissed in my face. You touch her again. I'll make sure your father knows exactly what kind of violent, unstable child you really are. Then she called Dad, crying, telling him I'd attacked Veronica unprovoked, that she was worried about my mental state. When Dad came home, he didn't even ask for my side, just looked at me with disappointment and told me I needed to get help. I learned to stop fighting after that. The emotional abuse was worse. Lydia was an artist at it, always operating just below Dad's radar, always making sure there were no marks, no obvious evidence. She'd compare me to Veronica constantly, loudly wondering why I couldn't be more like her. She'd throw away college brochures that came for me, then help Veronica apply to top schools. She'd give Veronica money for clothes and necessities while telling me I needed to learn the value of money and get a job. I did get a job at 16. I worked 20 hours a week at a cafe, saving every penny for college because I knew Dad wouldn't pay. Lydia made sure of that, convincing him I needed to learn responsibility and that helping me financially would enable my problems. Meanwhile, Veronica got a credit card with no limit and a new car for her 16th birthday. By the time I was 18, I'd saved $8,000. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Proof that I could survive on my own, that I'd escape this house and never look back. Lydia stole it. She had access to my account. Dad had insisted on it for emergencies when I opened it at 16. One day, it was simply empty. When I confronted her, she looked me dead in the eye and said, I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe you spent it and forgot. You have been so stressed lately. She gasped, a hand to her mouth. Oh God, Claire, are you using drugs? She said it loudly right as Dad walked in, and just like that, my stolen savings became evidence of my addiction problem. Dad demanded I take a drug test. I passed, of course, but the seed was planted. Now I wasn't just troubled, I was potentially an addict. Lydia was a genius. I worked through college, taking out massive loans, living in the cheapest apartments, eating ramen for weeks. Meanwhile, Veronica went to Columbia on Dad's dime, lived in a luxury apartment in Manhattan, and posted Instagram photos of her glamorous life while I was working double shifts at a campus bookstore. Dad and I barely spoke. Lydia had poisoned that well completely. On the rare occasions I came home for holidays, I was treated like a guest, an unwelcome one. Veronica's accomplishments were celebrated loudly, the successful modeling gigs, the influencer partnerships, the rich boyfriends. My college graduation was acknowledged with a card. No one came to the ceremony. And then I met Derek. Derek Harrison, charming and handsome, from a wealthy family. He was different, I thought. He saw me, appreciated me. For the first time in years, someone made me feel valued. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover until much later in my first life, was that Lydia had introduced us. Deliberately. Because Derek was Veronica's ex-boyfriend, and Veronica wanted him back. I was bait. A pawn. Someone for Derek to date while Veronica played hard to get, made him jealous, made him realize what he'd lost, and I fell for it completely. The restaurant humiliation was just the opening move. After that night, Derek broke up with me but stayed close, always needing just one more chance to explain. I gave it to him, multiple times, while he was sleeping with Veronica behind my back. When I finally caught them together, walked in on them at a family dinner I wasn't supposed to attend, Veronica just laughed. Did you really think he wanted you? Claire, you were practice. You were the before picture that made me look better. Derek had the decency to look uncomfortable, but he didn't defend me, didn't apologize, just left with Veronica while I stood there shaking, feeling my world crumble. It got worse. Lydia had been stealing from Dad for years, it turned out, funneling money from his accounts, taking out credit cards in his name, forging his signature on loans. By the time he discovered it, he was $800,000 in debt and facing bankruptcy. Lydia blamed me. She showed Dad evidence, forged bank statements, fake email accounts, doctored photos. She'd been planning it for years, creating a paper trail that made it look like I was the one stealing from him, that I'd been using my drug money from college to fund a secret life. Dad believed her. Of course he did. I was the troubled daughter, the one who'd been difficult since childhood. Veronica was the good one, the one who'd stood by him. And Lydia was the devoted wife, heartbroken that she'd married into such a dysfunctional family situation. I tried to fight it. Got a lawyer with money I didn't have. But Lydia's forgeries were perfect, and she had Veronica backing up every lie. Derek even testified that I'd seemed secretive about money during our relationship. The case was a disaster. Dad cut me out of his will completely, disowned me, told me I was dead to him. I was 24, drowning in legal debt on top of my student loans, working 3 jobs just to survive. No family, no support system, no safety net. I'd lost everything. But I kept fighting. I'm not sure why. Stubbornness, maybe. Some part of me that refused to let them win. I worked myself to exhaustion, determined to prove them wrong, to somehow rebuild my life from ashes. It didn't matter. At 28, I collapsed at work. Heart attack, they said, brought on by extreme stress, malnutrition, and years of chronic anxiety. I died in the ambulance alone, thinking about how unfair it all was, how I'd never done anything to deserve this, how they'd stolen everything from me and would never face consequences. My last thought was wishing I could do it all over again, make different choices, fight back. And then I woke up in my 18-year-old body in my childhood bedroom on the morning of my high school graduation. I'd spent the first week in shock, convinced I was having a psychotic break. But the memories were too vivid, too specific. I knew things I couldn't possibly know, what Lydia would say at breakfast, what dress Veronica would wear to graduation, the exact way Dad would check his phone during my speech and miss the whole thing because he was texting Lydia about dinner plans. It all happened exactly as I remembered. I had been reborn, given a second chance. And this time, I would not be a victim. The first change I made was small. I hid my savings better. Opened a secret account at a different bank, one Lydia couldn't access. I remembered exactly when she'd steal from me in the first timeline. And I made sure when she checked my old account, there was only $500 there. Enough to make her think it wasn't worth taking yet. My real money, I kept growing. Every paycheck, every tip straight into my secret account. By the time I was 19, I had $15,000 saved. Real money. Power. The second change, I documented everything. Every cruel comment from Lydia, every time she accidentally damaged my things. Every instance of favoritism. I kept a journal, backed up digitally with dates and details. I installed a small camera in my room after the art portfolio incident. This time, when Veronica destroyed my work, I had video evidence. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I just collected evidence, smiled politely, and played the role of beaten down Claire. Let them think they were winning. The third change, I studied them. In my first life, I'd been too hurt, too focused on my own pain to really see what Lydia and Veronica were doing. This time, I watched. I noticed Lydia's spending habits, her secret credit cards, the way she was slowly embezzling from Dad. I saw Veronica's casual cruelty to everyone around her, the way she manipulated and used people. I learned their patterns, their weaknesses, their secrets. And I waited. The Derek situation was my first real test. In my original timeline, I'd been devastated when he stood me up, desperate when he came crawling back, destroyed when I discovered his betrayal. This time, I knew it was coming. Knew he was using me to make Veronica jealous. So I played along, but with modifications. I dated Derek, but kept him at arm's length. No sex, despite his pushing, no I love yous, no shared bank accounts or loaned money. When he asked to borrow $1,000 for car repairs, I said no. A first for me. The old Claire would have given him everything. I watched him get frustrated, watched him start texting Veronica more frequently, staying out later, making excuses. I knew the restaurant stood up was coming because I'd orchestrated it this time. I'd asked Derek to dinner on a night I knew Veronica would coincidentally invite him out. And while they were together at Murphy's, I was maxing out his credit card and planting the seeds of my revenge. Because I'd remembered something crucial. Derek's family money wasn't really his. It was a trust fund controlled by his grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Harrison who didn't approve of Derek's lifestyle. In my first life, I'd never met her. This time, I made sure I did. It wasn't hard. Margaret volunteered at a local art gallery, the same one where I'd submitted my portfolio, rebuilt from memory, every piece I'd lost. She'd noticed my work, contacted me about a showing. We'd had coffee. I'd been polite, humble, genuinely grateful for her interest. I'd also casually mentioned I was dating her grandson. Margaret had gotten very quiet. Then, "How is Derek treating you, dear?" "Wonderfully," I'd lied. "He's so considerate. Always paying for dinners, making sure I'm comfortable. He's not like other guys my age. He's mature, responsible." The lies had been strategic. Margaret knew Derek wasn't any of those things. When she inevitably checked on him, discovered his actual behavior, the contrast between what I'd said and reality would be stark. The restaurant incident was just the catalyst I needed. I'd timed it perfectly. After I left the restaurant, I'd sent Margaret a single text. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I think there's been a mistake with Derek's credit card. The restaurant charged him for a dinner I ate alone tonight. He got held up at work. I feel terrible that he's being charged for something I ordered. Is there any way to dispute it? I saved the receipt if it helps." I attached a photo of the receipt, $1,200 for one person. Margaret called me within 20 minutes. "Claire, sweetheart, where is Derek right now?" "I'm not sure. He said he was working late at his father's firm." The uncertainty in my voice was calculated. "He's been doing that a lot lately. I'm sure it's just busy season or something." I could hear her sharp intake of breath. Derek didn't work at his father's firm. He'd been fired 3 months ago for incompetence, but was lying to everyone about it. "Claire, I'd like you to come to my house tomorrow for lunch. Just you. Don't tell Derek." "Of course, Mrs. Harrison." That lunch changed everything. Margaret showed me Derek's financial records. She had access to all of it through the trust. He was $47,000 in debt from online gambling, a habit I'd had no idea about in my first life. He'd been using me to maintain appearances, to seem settled so his grandmother wouldn't cut him off completely. "I've been watching him spiral," Margaret said quietly. I'd hoped he'd found someone who could be a good influence, but it seems he's simply better at lying than I gave him credit for. She poured us both tea, her hands steady despite the tremor of age. "Tell me, dear, has Derek asked you for money?" I could have lied, played the perfect victim. But I'd learned something important in my rebirth. The best revenge wasn't just punishing the guilty. It was building alliances with the powerful. Once, I admitted, I said no, and I think there might be someone else. I've suspected for a while, but I didn't want to believe it. "Who?" "My stepsister, Veronica." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "The model? I've seen her on his social media." "They dated before me. I think..." I let my voice crack convincingly. "I think I was just a distraction until she wanted him back." I showed Margaret my phone then, pulling up Lydia's message from the night before, the one with the photo of Derek and Veronica at Murphy's. Margaret stared at it for a long moment. Then she made a phone call. One phone call, and Derek's trust fund was frozen pending an ethical review. One phone call, and he was summoned to his grandmother's house for a discussion about his future. One phone call, and my petty revenge became something much bigger. Derek called me 3 days later, panicking. "Claire, I need to see you. It's important." We met at a coffee shop. He looked terrible, unshaven, rumpled, desperate. "My grandmother cut off my money. She says I've been fiscally irresponsible and morally questionable. Did you say something to her?" I blinked innocently. "About what?" "I had lunch with her once, Derek. We talked about art." "She's asking about Veronica, about us." "Claire, I know things have been weird lately, but I need you to tell her it's not what it looks like. Tell her we're solid, that I'm committed to you." "Are you?" He reached across the table, grabbed my hand. His palm was sweaty. "Of course, baby, you're the best thing in my life. I know I missed our dinner last week, and the one before that, and the one before that. I've been stressed. The job, You don't have a job, Derek. You were fired months ago. His face went white. Who told you that? Your grandmother showed me your financial records. The gambling debts, all of it. I pulled my hand back. I know you've been using me. I know about you and Veronica. I stood up. He grabbed my wrist too hard, hard enough to hurt. For a second, I saw real anger flash across his face, the same anger I'd seen years later in my first life when I'd confronted him. But this time, I had a camera running in my purse. This time, I wasn't alone and undefended. Let go of me. Claire, you have to help me fix this. Tell my grandmother you made a mistake, that you misunderstood. No. You bitch. He said it quietly, viciously. You know what? Veronica was right about you. You're nothing. A pathetic little victim who'll never be anything more than... A throat cleared behind us. Margaret Harrison stood there, her personal assistant beside her, both of them clearly having heard every word. Derek dropped my wrist like it was on fire. Grandmother, Save it. Margaret's voice was cold. Claire, dear, are you all right? I nodded, rubbing my wrist where Derek had grabbed it. The mark was already reddening. Margaret turned to her grandson. You have until the end of the month to move out of the apartment I've been paying for. The trust is dissolved. You'll receive nothing further from me, now or after my death. You're on your own, Derek. Maybe it will teach you the value of honest work. Derek's face crumbled. You can't. Grandmother, please. I can and I have. Now leave before I call the police and show them the video of you assaulting this young woman. He left, and I never saw him again. But I saw what happened to him, thanks to Margaret's network. Derek tried to move in with Veronica, who dumped him when she realized he was broke. He tried to get money from his parents, who sided with Margaret. Last I heard, he was living in a studio apartment in a bad part of town, working at a car dealership, drowning in debt. It was more than satisfying. It was justice. And it was just the beginning. Margaret and I became close after that. She saw something in me, maybe reminded her of herself when she was young, she said. She commissioned several of my paintings for her collection. She introduced me to gallery owners and collectors. She wrote me a letter of recommendation for the art school I'd been dreaming of, the one I'd never been able to afford in my first life. I got in, full scholarship plus a stipend, but I delayed enrollment by a year because I had other work to do first. I turned 20 in my new timeline with $30,000 in my secret savings and a plan. I'd been patient playing the long game, but now it was time to start dismantling Lydia's empire of lies. It started with Dad. I'd avoided confronting him in my first life, too hurt, too angry, too convinced he'd chosen them over me. This time, I was strategic. I researched his business schedule and found a day when he'd be working from home when Lydia and Veronica were out shopping. I knocked on his home office door, Dad, can we talk? He looked surprised to see me. We'd barely spoken in the 2 years since graduation beyond basic pleasantries at forced family dinners. Claire, of course, come in. I sat across from his desk, the same desk where I'd once done homework as a little girl, where Mom had kept fresh flowers and family photos. Now it was sterile, professional. The photos were all of Veronica. I need to talk to you about Mom's life insurance policy. Dad frowned. What about it? You set up a trust for me with it, right? When I turned 18, I was supposed to have access to it for college expenses. His frown deepened. Claire, we've discussed this. That money went to paying for the house renovations, and that's not what the policy said, Dad. I looked it up. Mom's policy was for $500,000, specifically designated for my education and welfare. I pulled out papers from my bag, copies of the original policy I'd requested from the insurance company. It was supposed to be in a trust, managed by you, but available to me at 18. I never saw a penny of it. Dad took the papers, his face growing pale as he read. I don't understand. Lydia handled all of this, she said. What did she say? That there were estate taxes, that most of the money went to paying off your mother's medical debts. Mom's medical bills were covered by her insurance, and estate taxes wouldn't have consumed $500,000, Dad. I checked. I slid another paper across the desk. This is a record of large deposits into Lydia's personal account, starting about 6 months after you got married. The total comes to about $480,000 over the course of 8 years. I watched my father's face change as he looked at the evidence. Confusion, then disbelief, then the dawning of a terrible realization. The renovations, he said slowly. The addition, Lydia wanted, Veronica's car, the apartment in Manhattan. I thought I was paying for those, but Lydia said she'd gotten good deals, used her savings. She used my mother's money, Dad. She stole my inheritance and used it to buy things for herself and Veronica while I worked 3 jobs to put myself through community college. His hands shook. Claire, I didn't know. She showed me documents, said everything was handled properly. I know, she's good at lying. I kept my voice level, devoid of accusation. This wasn't about making Dad feel guilty. It was about opening his eyes. Dad, I need you to really look at your finances, all of them. Credit cards, bank accounts, everything. I think you'll find some surprises. Why? But his voice was hollow. He was already starting to suspect. Because I think she's been stealing from you too, and I think she's planning to leave you bankrupt and blame it on someone else. I left him with that, planted the seed and walked away. For 3 days, nothing happened. I went to work, attended my community college classes, lived my quiet life. Then Dad called. Claire, I need to see you, just you, not at the house. We met at a small diner across town. Dad looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. There were papers spread across the table, bank statements, credit reports, loan documents. You were right, he said. His voice was hoarse. She's been forging my signature, taking out credit cards in my name. There are loans I never authorized, charges I never made. I'm $600,000 in debt, Claire. I'm going to lose the house, the business, everything. I felt a surge of satisfaction but kept my face sympathetic. What are you going to do? I've already filed for divorce. I went to a lawyer yesterday, showed him everything. He says I have grounds for fraud, embezzlement, forgery. Claire, I'm so sorry. He looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years. She showed me documents that made you look. I thought you were the one stealing from me. I thought you'd developed a drug problem in college. God, Claire, I believed her over my own daughter. I know. How can you even stand to look at me? This was the moment I'd dreamed of in my first life. The apology I'd never gotten. The validation that I'd been right all along, that I'd been the victim. But standing there, seeing my father broken and ashamed, I realized something. I didn't want his guilt. I wanted his action. You can make it right, I said quietly. Help me get back what she stole from me and make sure she faces consequences, real consequences. Dad nodded slowly. I will. I promise you, Claire, I will. The divorce proceedings were brutal. Lydia fought like a cornered animal, making wild accusations, trying to pin the financial fraud on Dad, then on me, then on his business partner. She brought in Veronica to testify about what a loving mother and wife she'd been. But we had evidence, forensic side, accountants who traced every fraudulent transaction back to Lydia's accounts, handwriting experts who confirmed the forgeries, bank records that showed the systematic theft of my mother's life insurance money. And we had something else. Video evidence of Veronica destroying my art portfolio, carefully saved and time-stamped from my hidden camera. Evidence of Lydia's emotional abuse recorded over months. Phone records showing communication between Lydia and Derek Harrison, confirming she'd orchestrated our relationship to hurt me. The judge was not amused. Lydia was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and forgery, felonies that carried serious prison time. The civil suit that Dad and I filed jointly was even more damaging. We sued for the return of my mother's life insurance money, plus damages for emotional distress and the cost of the therapy I'd need to deal with years of abuse. Veronica, meanwhile, was falling apart. Her modeling career had been built on money and connections Lydia had stolen. When those dried up, the agencies dropped her. Her influencer partnerships disappeared when her follower count started plummeting. People were discovering she'd been buying fake followers, something I'd anonymously tipped off several marketing watchdog groups about. She tried to reach out to me once, about 6 months into the legal battle, called me crying, begging me to tell them the truth, that Mom didn't mean any harm. The truth? I'd said calmly. The truth is that your mother stole $500,000 from me, abused me for a decade, and tried to destroy my life. The truth is that you participated in that abuse willingly, gleefully. You destroyed my artwork. You stole my boyfriend for fun. You stood by while your mother poisoned my father against me. Which truth would you like me to tell, Veronica? She'd hung up, sobbing. I didn't feel bad about it. The trial lasted 3 months. Lydia represented herself after burning through multiple lawyers who quit when they realized how guilty she was. She ranted in court about how ungrateful I was, how I'd seduced her innocent husband, how I'd fabricated everything to steal from her. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Lydia was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The civil judgment was for $800,000, the life insurance money plus damages, plus interest, plus punitive damages for the emotional abuse. Since she'd already spent most of what she'd stolen, it meant she'd be paying it off for the rest of her life, assuming she ever got out of prison and could earn money. Veronica, who'd been found liable as an accomplice in some of the theft, was ordered to pay $50,000 in damages. She didn't have it. Her credit cards were maxed out, her apartment was being foreclosed on, her car was repossessed. She moved back in with her biological father, a man she'd always been ashamed of because he was just a plumber. Last I heard, she was working at a local diner, trying to pay off her debts, all her social media accounts deleted in shame. And me? I started art school the fall after the trial ended. Margaret Harrison continued to mentor me, introducing me to collectors and gallery owners. My work started selling, first for hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. I was featured in several prestigious exhibitions. Critics called my style hauntingly beautiful and emotionally raw. I worked hard, harder than I ever had in my first life, because this time I wasn't weighed down by abuse and gaslighting and constant sabotage. This time I had support from Dad, who was desperately trying to make up for years of neglect, from Margaret, who believed in my talent, from the therapist I could finally afford, who helped me process the trauma of both timelines. By the time I was 25, I was financially stable. By 30, I was wealthy. My paintings sold for 6 figures. I had gallery showings in New York, Paris, Tokyo. I'd published 2 art books. I'd been commissioned to create pieces for museums and private collections around the world. I bought a beautiful loft in the city, filled it with light and plants and my own artwork. I traveled. I dated. Carefully, with boundaries, always making sure to vet people properly. I made real friends, people who valued me for who I was. And I made sure to visit Lydia in prison once a year. Not out of forgiveness, not out of any desire to reconcile, but because I wanted her to see what I'd become. Wanted her to see me walk in wearing designer clothes I'd bought with my own money, carrying a portfolio of my latest work, living the life she'd tried so hard to destroy. The first visit, she'd screamed at me, called me every name in the book, told me I'd ruined her life, that I was an ungrateful bitch who'd destroyed their family. I'd just smiled. You did this to yourself, Lydia. You spent a decade stealing from me, abusing me, trying to break me. And you failed. I'm successful, I'm happy, and you're here in a cage for the rest of your best years. That's not my fault. That's justice. By the 5th visit, she didn't scream anymore. Just sat across from me, looking old and hollow, listening as I told her about my latest gallery opening, my newest relationship, the house I'd bought for Dad to make up for the one she'd cost him. Why do you keep coming here? She asked once, her voice empty. To remind myself that I won, I said simply. That you tried to destroy me and failed, that every year you sit in here is a year I'm out there, thriving. The visits were cathartic in a way therapy couldn't quite match. Dad and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. It wasn't easy. There were years of hurt to work through, trust to rebuild, but he tried. He sold his business and retired, using the money to pay off his debts and start over. He went to therapy too, dealing with his own guilt and the realization of how thoroughly Lydia had manipulated him. We had dinner every week. Sometimes we talked about Mom, Finally, after years of her memory being buried under Lydia's presence. Dad told me stories about their early years together, about how Mom had been a painter too, how she'd dreamed of me following in her footsteps. "She'd be so proud of you," he said once, tears in his eyes, "and so ashamed of me for almost destroying what she wanted most, for you to be happy and successful." "You didn't destroy it," I said. "You were manipulated. We both were. But you survived it. You thrived despite it." "I don't know how you did that, Claire." I almost told him then about the rebirth, about living this life twice, about the knowledge that had saved me. But I didn't. Some things were too strange to explain, even to people you loved. "I survived because I had to," I said instead, "because the alternative was letting them win." Margaret passed away when I was 32, leaving me a substantial portion of her estate, including several properties and her entire art collection. The will stated that she'd watched me grow from a scared, hurt young woman into someone strong and successful, and she was proud to have played a small part in that journey. Derek tried to contest the will, claiming he deserved the money as her blood relation. The judge threw it out, noting Derek's history of financial irresponsibility and his grandmother's clear wishes. Last I heard, Derek was still working at that car dealership, still drowning in debt, still bitter about how his life had turned out. I felt nothing for him. Not satisfaction, not pity. Nothing. He was simply irrelevant to my life. By 35, I was at the peak of my career. My paintings hung in major museums. I'd been commissioned to create the official portrait of a senator. I had more money than I could spend in 2 lifetimes. I split my time between my loft in the city and a beautiful house in the countryside where I could paint in peace. And I was in love. Her name was Elena, and she was an architect I'd met at a gallery opening. She was brilliant and kind and saw me, really saw me, in a way few people ever had. She knew about my past, about the abuse and the trial and the years of rebuilding. She held me when I had nightmares about my first life, the memories that still haunted me sometimes. We got married in a small ceremony with close friends and Dad. No drama, no toxicity, just love and joy and the promise of a future built on mutual respect and genuine care. Sometimes I wondered what my first life would have looked like if I'd known then what I knew now. If I'd been brave enough to fight back earlier, smart enough to document the abuse, strong enough to cut off contact with people who hurt me. But then I realized I wouldn't have learned those things without dying first, without hitting rock bottom so hard that I came back changed. The rebirth hadn't just given me foreknowledge, it had given me perspective, wisdom, the ability to see patterns and plan ahead. I'd been forged in fire twice, once by Lydia's abuse and once by death itself, and I'd emerged stronger each time. Lydia got out of prison when I was 38 after serving 10 years of her sentence. Veronica picked her up. I saw photos online, neither of them looking at the cameras. They'd both aged badly. Lydia looked frail and broken. Veronica looked exhausted and worn, still working service jobs, still paying off her debts. Part of me wondered if they'd try to contact me, to apologize or beg for forgiveness or money. They didn't. Maybe they knew better. Maybe they were too ashamed. Maybe they simply had nothing left to say. I didn't reach out either. My annual prison visits had been about closure, about proving to myself that I'd won. Now that chapter was over. They were free to live what remained of their lives, but those lives would never intersect with mine again. I'd moved on. Completely. Totally. Finally. The last time I thought about Derek was at a charity gala where Margaret's foundation was presenting an award in her name. I was on the board of directors helping to choose young artists to receive grants and mentorship. We'd just awarded a scholarship to a talented 19-year-old girl from a troubled background when someone called my name. I turned and saw him across the room. Derek, looking significantly older than his 39 years, in a cheap suit that didn't quite fit, holding a drink and staring at me like I was a ghost. I was wearing a custom gown, jewelry Elena had designed specifically for me, surrounded by friends and colleagues, and success. The contrast couldn't have been starker. He started to walk over. I turned away, back to my conversation, dismissing him without a word, because that was the ultimate revenge, not caring, not even enough to acknowledge his existence. I felt Elena's hand slip into mine, felt her squeeze gently. She'd seen him too, recognized him from stories I'd told. "You okay?" she whispered. "Perfect," I said and meant it. Later that night in our home, Elena asked me something she'd been wondering about for a while. Do you ever wish it had been different? That your stepmother and stepsister had been kind? That you'd had a normal family? I considered the question carefully. Sometimes, I admitted. But then I think about who I'd be if things had been easy. If I hadn't learned to fight, to plan, to protect myself. Would I be as successful, as strong, as careful about who I let into my life? You might have been happier. Maybe, or maybe I'd have been complacent, taken things for granted. Never appreciated what I have now. I pulled her closer. Everything I am, everything I've built. It came from surviving them, from refusing to let them destroy me. I paid a terrible price for these lessons, but I did learn them. And I won't forget them. No regrets? Only one, I said. That my mother didn't get to see how I turned out. That she died thinking I'd be raised by a father who loved me and protected me. She couldn't have known what would happen. Elena kissed my forehead. She'd be incredibly proud of you, I'm sure of it. I thought about my 2 lives, the first where I'd been destroyed, and the second where I'd fought back and won. The girl who'd died alone and broken in an ambulance, and the woman who'd rebuilt herself into someone powerful and successful and finally happy. It had taken dying to learn how to truly live. Taken losing everything to learn what was worth fighting for. Taken betrayal to learn who deserved my trust, but I'd learned. And I'd won. The story came full circle one more time years later. I was 45 at the opening of my retrospective at a major museum, a survey of my entire career from those early sketches I'd recreated from memory to my newest work. The show was a massive success, sold-out crowds, glowing reviews. Dad was there, elderly now but proud. Elena beside me as always. Friends and colleagues from around the world. It was everything I'd dreamed of in both lives. Recognition, respect, celebration of my work. And in the back of the gallery, barely visible, I saw Veronica. She hadn't tried to come in, hadn't bought a ticket, just stood outside looking through the windows at the crowds, at the paintings, at me giving a speech about artistic journey and overcoming adversity. Our eyes met for just a moment. I saw everything in her expression, regret, envy, loss, the weight of years of consequences. She was 53 now, her beauty long faded, her life small and constrained by the debts and reputation she'd earned. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, just held her gaze for a long moment, letting her see everything I'd become, everything she'd tried to prevent me from being. Then I turned back to my celebration, back to my life, back to the people who actually mattered. Because that was the final lesson. Victory wasn't about destroying your enemies. It was about building a life so full and rich and beautiful that they became irrelevant. It was about winning so completely that their existence in the world couldn't touch you anymore. I'd let Derek stand me up at dinner in my first life, and it had destroyed me. In my second life, I'd let him stand me up again, but this time, I'd never showed up to his world ever again. And that had made all the difference. The exhibition ran for 6 months. My work sold for record prices. I donated a substantial portion of the proceeds to a charity supporting young artists from abusive homes, ensuring others might have the support I'd lacked in my first timeline. Elena and I traveled after that, spending a year abroad while I worked on a new series inspired by themes of rebirth and transformation. We returned to a beautiful house, a loving family, a life filled with purpose and joy. Sometimes, late at night, I'd dream of my first life, the pain, the betrayal, the slow destruction of everything I'd been. I'd wake up, gasping, certain I was back there, certain it had all been a dream. Then I'd feel Elena beside me, see my paintings on the walls, remember the trial and the victory and the years of building something better. And I'd know this was real. This life, this success, this happiness, I'd earned it all, not through luck or privilege, but through strategy and strength and the knowledge that comes from living twice. I'd died once, been reborn, and I'd made every single moment count. That was my revenge. Not destruction, but creation. Not tearing them down, but building myself up so high they couldn't reach me anymore. I'd let him stand me up at dinner in my first life. In my second life, I never showed up to his or their world again, and I'd never been happier.